So Elizabeth told the origin story, and that is how it all started when I took her to dinner, and I could not be more thankful that Elizabeth has been my partner in this. She is, of course, as everybody knows, the brains of the operation, and she makes sure that these events come out the way that they have, and that the Indy comes out every morning as well. I also want to do what I always do with these events, and it's and anytime I'm in public, the real heart and soul of the Indy is the staff and the reporters. They make us look good every day. I believe that it's the best group of young reporters in the country, and they're in the back, and I hope they'll stand up and so you can take a look at them. So we are really happy. This is our first big fundraising month that we've ever done, and we're doing really well. We hoped to get to 150,000 this month. We're already closing in on 400,000, and all of you here are part of that, and I really do appreciate it. And I want to tell you that we're really starting to feel like we're almost there, that we're turning a corner. It's not hard. I mean, it is hard doing a nonprofit startup, but the support from the diverse group of people here has meant a lot. So for those of you who aren't members yet, I hope you will become members. Tell your friends, as I like to say, tell your enemies, tell the people you meet on the way to your car tonight, tell everybody to go to the site and check it out. Our biggest problem, by the way, is that there's still too many people who don't know about us. Once they find out about us, once they go on the site, they're going to become donors. So I hope you will do that. Before I bring Chuck up here, I do want to say thank you to the Smith Center staff, which is just incredible. Every time we do an event here, and especially to Myron, whose room this is, and I've seen him here tonight. Let's give them all a round of applause, please. Now for the reason y'all came here tonight. I can't tell you what a pleasure it is to have Chuck Todd here. You know, I knew of Chuck, of course, before I actually met Chuck. And I mean, going way back when he was working at something that some of you may remember called Hotline, which was kind of a must-read for any political junkie. All right, applause for the Hotline, Chuck. What do you think? It's kind of like my flash newsletter that you guys may be familiar with, except it's a lot better. So I think I finally met Chuck in 2008 after Nevada became an early caucus state. To be honest, I don't think Chuck could have found Nevada on a map before we became an early caucus state. But after he discovered how much we mattered, he and I got to know each other a little bit. Chuck's had me on Meet the Press and his MSNBC show. In fact, I was on it today. Chuck has been very, very supportive. I don't know how many of you know this, of the Indy, not just with his checkbook, but with his words. He talks well of the Indy to others and publicly. Chuck's not only one of the best and most knowledgeable journalists in the country and that I've ever met, he's a genuinely good guy, and I'm thrilled that he's here tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Chuck Todd.
There's a rule at Meet the Press, we got to be nice to Buffalo guys.
People always feel sorry for Buffalo guys.
Yeah,
I think I know why.
It's tough.
So just so you know, Chuck and I are going to have a conversation for a little bit, and then we're going to take questions. If you want to ask Chuck any questions later on. But we want to talk a little bit about politics, campaigns, and the media. So you've watched every political cycle pretty closely for about 25 years or so. Not that I want to date you too much. And I'm hearing from people this time, I'm wondering if you're hearing it, this cycle's different in some way. They can't really put their finger on it. There's something different. Is it different or is it the same?
Well, ask me on November 7th, right? You know, my deputy, Mark Murray, that helps put First Read together, our newsletter in the morning that we put out, said something to me, and he goes, you know, and I think you and I were talking about this earlier, you know, I grew up, and probably everybody in this room grew up, with the rules of politics were this, which was you fought maybe it was between the 35s or the 40-yard lines. And then we said, oh, it's the 45-yard lines. But at the end, in a general election, it was all about finding a consensus at the end, whether it's in the general election or in a piece of legislation or whatever. But there was always this sort of, you had to find your way to the middle. And the way, for instance, people like me or you would assess a candidate or assess a campaign would be, well, which candidate has a better shot at sort of winning over that consensus, getting the voters in between the 45s. And as you watch what's happening this cycle, and you watch what Trump is, it's possible that one of the things, and I think why we in the media may be a bit disoriented sometimes in watching these election returns, is that our politics really is about, forcing the middle to pick a side rather than the other way around, which is used to be having the two parties were trying to find a way how to persuade the middle, where instead it's sort of like, all right, middle, take it or leave it. You're either with me or against me. Everything is not just red and blue, it's black and white. And there's something to be said about it. I look at my home state of Florida, and the candidate that's got the most juice right now of anybody is this gentleman named Andrew Gillum. And he's running the complete opposite of the race you would have said a Democrat needed to run to win in the state of Florida. In fact, everybody, myself, all the sort of smarty pants people of Florida said, oh, Gwen Graham, daughter of former Governor and Senator Bob Graham, and she was a centrist congresswoman, representative, was the only Democrat to knock off a Republican member of Congress in 2014. That's who you wanted. And yet, Andrew Gillum is painting in bright colors, right? In a sense. And it's sort of forcing the middle to pick a side. And I think that is what's disorienting a little bit, is that I think our politics is moving, the parties are moving that way. Look at, Dean Heller in some ways is emblematic of this. I think, and you're watching some candidates look disoriented themselves. I think Dean Heller assumed he had to move to the middle when you're in a swing state. But that turned out to be politically the wrong decision, and it almost ended his political career early. Now, he may end up losing anyway, but he's got a better shot at winning by moving away from the middle. And so that, I think, is the biggest change, is that the candidate who best appeals to the middle may not win most of these close races.
How did that evolve? Democrats will say, look, this happened because Obama was elected and then the Tea Party caused all this division. Republicans will say, don't you remember what the Democrats did when George W. Bush was president and the invasion of Iraq? How did this happen?
It's hard not to look at the diversity issue and not say that this is as sort of the country gets less white, that we're in this, and this is where it could be, this is why I think this may be, we're in the middle of a transition, and as, part of me jokes, it's the millennials versus the boomers, and us people in Gen X are gonna mediate the dispute. But at the end of the day, I would want to be more politically incorrect, say, oh, it's not race, it's culture. It's just say, it's race. When you really look at it, it feels like the real divide is that more than anything, and that is what is created, and you want to call it identity politics, but this idea that your personal identity, your cultural identity fits with your political party, and so I think that is what's exasperated this, and then and Donald Trump took advantage of a situation, right? He did sort of find an opening here, and he took advantage of it.
Man, I didn't think the guy was going to be this cynical. Did you guys?
I think we have to be optimistically cynical. I actually think one of the things, and I've in some ways I've followed your lead. There's this sense in network television and the big national media that we have to be 30,000 feet, we have to be a little above it all. I've been watching you the last 10 years, and I feel like you've been seeing this coming, and you saw as more politicians felt that they could ignore the press or bully the press or essentially lie to voters and get away with it in some ways. You are aggressively calling BS not in a partisan way, but in that sort of that accountability way. And I think that is what I think part of our credibility problem in the press is we've sugarcoated things too much. I think part of the reason why Donald Trump strikes a chord is that he doesn't sugarcoat his views. He may not believe what he says, but he's comfortable saying what you want to say, right? And so, so when you say it's like, yeah, I think we have to be more direct in our observations. Instead of giving subtle, nuanced wink and a nod, that's a dog whistle, and to say, no, it's a whistle.
I want to talk a little bit about, I don't know how many of you saw Chuck's piece that he wrote in The Atlantic last month about how journalism should change. I want to talk about that in a little while, but I want to stick in just to politics a little bit first. You brought up Trump, of course. Is covering Trump unlike anything you've ever done?
Yes. Here's what I say. It's intellectually easy and emotionally exhausting. He's not hard to figure out. He telegraphs everything. Okay, so in that sense, it's not difficult. He's transactional. He's cynically transactional. And if you look at how he grew up, it's actually perfectly understandable. I'm spending a lot of time looking at sort of the emergence of Donald Trump, the adult, through the lens of a political career rather than through everybody else had looked at him through a business career. And you realize that his success was always based on some transactional relationship with government. And government was there to be, particularly on the local level, especially his father in New York City, it was on who you knew and who you gave money to. And essentially, Donald J. Trump took that lesson in 1970 from his father when suddenly his father's ability to give money made Donald Trump friends with the governor at the time, Hugh Carey. He saw that as a 22-year-old and realized that's how you get things done. And he's operated that way ever since. So in that sense, that's when I say he's intellectually easy to figure out. He's just an old-fashioned transactional politician. To the point, but with sort of situational ethics. And I say this, it actually is what politics was in the 60s and 70s, though. Is that in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, that's the way most politicians conducted business. That was the good old days, as I like to remind people. But that's the way it was conducted a lot. And that's why, in that sense, he's easy to figure out. But it's emotionally exhausting. And I think we still are struggling, and I struggle with this every day in our meetings. We have this fight, when it comes to his tweets or what he says is, there was that saying during the campaign, don't take him literally, take him seriously. I think we have to cover him seriously, but not literally. I do think we overcover certain things he says. A classic mistake that was made is when, and I understand it, right, in the need of social media and to do a quick turnaround, almost like wire copy story. He's at a rally and says something about Robert E. Lee. It got overcovered. Look, he's going to say what he says, but was it a necessary top of the fold headline? No. And oh, by the way, people heard Robert E. Lee and didn't actually listen to his story. He was telling a Grant story very poorly, but he was actually telling a Grant story.
Right.
Who was a drunk. And that's what he was getting at, but he didn't know how to tell it. But that's what I mean. I think sometimes the biggest mistakes we make with the president collectively in the media, when I say Mr. We here, I don't refer to NBC, I refer to the entire media industrial complex, is that we sometimes cover him too literally.
It's interesting because you brought up the Robert E. Lee thing, in which of course, if you're on social media, and talk about being emotionally exhausted, is being on Twitter for a while and watch what people do. You almost think that we haven't learned the lessons that we should have learned when he was coming down that escalator and was announcing, and you were probably laughing, saying, "Oh, here we go. This is gonna be." And I was. Come on, this guy's a joke. He'll be out of the race by December. And when he said, I like heroes who weren't captured,
right?
That kind of stuff.
The traditional rules,
right? But still, he will say something, and it will become a big sensation. So the difficulty to me, I would think, in covering Trump, is that some of the stuff he says you think, okay, this is news. It's either crazy or incendiary or it's just newsworthy. And if you cover every single one of those, you will not only be doing what he wants you to do, but you won't be doing viewers, readers a service, because you won't be able to step back from it, because it's just this avalanche of this stuff. And that's a difficult thing to navigate, right?
He hacked the system. It was funny. Before his campaign started, I remember thinking, and I said this in a few talks, I said, the more, it feels as if the beginning of the rise of Facebook and Twitter, when I say the beginning, that's sort of 08, 10, and 12, and 14, those campaigns, a lot of political campaigns treated them as if it was like to be avoided, right? To try to control it. And I remember thinking, and I was like, boy, the candidate that portrays themselves as unafraid of this new media and is willing to just be on the record all the time could go a long way. I actually thought Chris Christie was going to be that candidate, right? That was sort of comfortable, and I thought, that will play well, and it turned out it was Trump. And I'm laughing recently at watching all these candidates as I'm going around. It has been impossible to get, the closer the race is, the harder it is to get anybody to come on the show. Whether they're a Democrat or Republican, whether they're winning, right? Because they're afraid of a mistake. They're afraid of a mistake getting amplified. And I'm sitting there going, did any of you not watch Donald Trump? He made a mistake every hour. But it was the spread offense. As I used to compare it to meaning it was sort of when the spread offense works well, right? It's sort of like we're sitting there and like, oh, he says something crazy at 7:30 and we're trying to tackle the crazy over here. Meanwhile, he's sent something crazy down here and that guy just ran for a touchdown on the wall, and all of a sudden it's the wall and people are going, build the wall. And so it's, in that sense, he hacked the system. And then there's one other superpower that he has that we are still shell-shocked about as a society, press, politics, which is he's shameless. And I know that sounds like, he doesn't feel, you talked about it, he can, whether he feels shame or not, he doesn't let it show. So, fine, I told you, I don't like heroes. My heroes don't get shot down in their plane. Normally you would shame somebody and they would retreat into their corner. Think about the hand. When has he apologized? Essentially only when Melania makes him. Access Hollywood tape. Right after that, that was the closest he ever came to at least showing a little bit of remorse. It was a hostage video, if you recall. I think it was an Instagram video. But he did it. And I think it was because Melania said, you got to do it. Or I'm leaving, or who knows what she said. I'm not going to overly speculate there. But that to me is why, it turns out that in our democracy, the way we sort of keep our elected leaders in line is shame. Right? We're the sunlight in our job. And then the other politicians are, amplify it. And, if you did something wrong, shame, whatever it is, or an investigation. And if you feel as if you did do something wrong, what do? You resign, you apologize, whatever. If Trump has shown a new way of doing this. And I don't think most people have the stomach for it. And it is interesting, as we found out, anybody who has attempted to copycat him, it's blown up in their face, right? Whether it's Marco Rubio, frankly, what Elizabeth Warren did. She did this on his, you're sitting there, what are you doing? You just responded on his terms. And I thought she had handled it perfectly 2 weeks ago when she did it in a very look, the controversy is what? Did she somehow get special treatment by claiming she was Native American? And so she shows the Boston Globe in her work life that never happened, and she shares that. Okay, that seemed to be the okay, you've got to deal with the problem before you run, okay. But then to do the video and to do all that, you're like, you have just handed Trump a cudgel to just beat the living days out of you more. And this is where I think that nobody has figured out, it is, I really think only Stormy Daniels has figured out how to get under his skin. And that's because she knows too much.
And that's only a half of it, though, in the sense that you're right that I think that no other politician can emulate him, and if they try, they're going to fail. And I do think you hit on it, that he is shameless. I really don't think he feels shame, or he couldn't do a lot of what he does.
He thinks it's an act. You know what it is? He really thinks this is WWE.
Right. It's a reality show, too.
And you know, by the way, the WWF, now E, you know, he was very, that's his, you know, what's very interesting is that's his, the guys that grew up on the WWF and the WWE and WrestleMania, those are the guys at the MAGA rallies now. I mean, this is his base. Like he's been in this, so he talks like a wrestler. If you followed a lot of wrestling, and you know, the professional wrestling, we had our own circuit in Florida when I grew up. You know, that back, remember, it was all little regional circuits, and you know, as a 10-year-old, you got into it. You know, remember, my great grandmother was into it. You know, we'd watch Dusty Rhodes together. You know, but it was a show. And Trump, in some ways, emulates a professional wrestler. If you followed wrestling in the 80s and 90s, Donald Trump would be a very familiar figure to you.
So I've known you for a little bit. I'm sitting up here with you. I don't see you having sleepy eyes. Where did that come from?
You know, well, he at one time called me a sleepy-eyed SOB.
Yeah.
That was a new one when he added the SOB. That was, my mom said, he owes me an apology. And I was like, I told my mom, I said, tweet it. Go ahead, Mom, tweet it. She didn't, but anyway. So I asked him, and his staff has asked him, because they're sort of perplexed. Because, you know, I'm like, you know, what is it? I have a theory. Because I asked him, and he goes, I don't remember. He goes, but when I come up with a nickname, I have to stick to it. He said this, he's like, it's branding. So I have a theory, because early on, this relationship I have, again, I go to professional wrestling. He loves to talk. He loves to gossip. When we talk, it's weird to have this amount of potential access to the president versus the lack of access I had to Barack Obama. It's just, but it's like no access before. So he loves the game and he loves the gossip, and he thinks that, you know, we're all just cast members sometimes. And so he watches a lot of it. NBC's his home network. Okay, he just watches more NBC than he does ABC or CBS. And I think one time he heard me on Today's Show, because every time if he didn't like something, I'd get a note. You get a note, and it's black Sharpie, you know, and he like circles something and says, "That's not true. Call me." And you know, you get it. Michael Cohen would fax it to you. It was sort of an interesting. It was just a weird operation. But I'm convinced he didn't like it, and he was like, "All right, I'm going to tweet something," and he hit pause on the DVR. And you ever hit pause on your DVR and the person's eyes are closed, and he's probably thinking, what am I going to call this guy? You know, and I think that's as simple as where it came from. But he doesn't remember, but he's so proud of his DVR. When I went in, I had last time I was in the Oval, had an off the record with him, 90 minutes. I'm like, don't you have other things to do? Like, I had to end the meeting. You ever watch these Fox and Friends interviews where they're like, you know, I know you're busy, sir, because they realized he's got diarrhea of the mouth, and it's like, you know, Bill Shine's calling up, please end the interview, you know. One of the first things he wanted to show me was his DVR. Look, I taped this, and he showed me his whole tape list. He really does. He has a set list of shows, and he watches them all at some point throughout the day during his various executive time. Which, by the way, that's one of my favorite phrases now. Yeah. Executive time. Yeah. I'm in some executive time. Yeah. I tell my staff all the time, I'd like to take a little executive time, please. I'll see you in 3 hours.
So it seems like, you know, you and I are the kind of guys who love to analyze at a granular level what's going on. You did it at Hotline. It's what Steve Kornacki does so well now with all the. You want logic to play some kind of role. You want predictability to play some kind of role. And this is just this entropy, this chaos that he has introduced into the system. Into the middle of this comes the Brett Kavanaugh episode. During that episode, was there any point in which you thought Kavanaugh might not be confirmed?
I thought it multiple times.
You did?
Under the old rules of Washington, he'd have been gone. Under the old rules of Washington, Mitch McConnell's warning in the New York Times to say, too much paper. right? Too much paper on this guy. It's just, it's just going to create more, that would have been enough to have moved to, to Kethridge or Hardiman, which I think were the most likely two. I don't think Amy Coney Barrett, because I don't know if she could have gotten either Susan Collins or Lisa Murkowski on the abortion issue. But I thought multiple times. But that's not Trump, right? Trump wants to fight. Look, the Kavanaugh, if Republicans may pick up Senate seats now.
Because of Kavanaugh, you think?
Because of Kavanaugh.
Really?
Kavanaugh changed Missouri, just flipped it. It was, basically a tie race advantage McCaskill. It's now not a tie race, it's close. You can't pull away too much in Missouri. It's a pink state, but there's a substantial Democratic base, and she's been around. But that flipped that race. Montana's more in play today than it was 2 weeks ago. This race is tighter than it was. You can't help but see, McSally was behind, now it's a dead heat. It moved the numbers. Cruz went from up 3 to up 8. That's real. Red got redder. And obviously the Senate battleground is playing, and we are having two different, this is a bizarre election cycle in that you literally have a Senate map that has no correlation with the House map. This is one of the few states where there are multiple competitive House races down the ballot of the Senate race. Ditto in Arizona, but you don't have that in Missouri. There's not a single competitive House race in Missouri on the target list, yet there's a Senate race. Ditto in Montana, ditto in Indiana. Obviously North Dakota, that's a single state. But the House is being fought in the suburbs, right? And the suburbs haven't really changed. There isn't a deep red in the suburbs as it is, so red didn't get redder. I do think the most important voter is the independent white male. College-educated independent white male. That's the swing voter. This is the voter that didn't like what happened to Kavanaugh, but also doesn't like Trump's character. And that to me is that's the voter that I think Democrats were on their way to winning 2 weeks ago. And right now, I'll give a little tease. We've got a new national NBC Wall Street Journal poll that I'll debut on Sunday morning. Let's just say our poll doesn't look like a poll would look like at this point in time if it were going to be a Democratic wave. Things have shifted. It's advantage Democrats, but it's not a wave right now.
Is that because Republicans, you think, you said red got redder, Republicans are more energized to turn out because of what happened with Kavanaugh? Are there other factors? We have a bipartisan polling team. You know these guys, Bill McInturff, the Republican, Fred Yang, the Democrat. I think they do lots of races out here. You interact with them, they're two of the better ones on each side of the aisle. And I asked Bill this, I said, how much of this is Republican, just sort of, and he says, look, some of it is just simply Republicans coming home 2 weeks earlier than they would have come home. So there is some of that. But some of it is, the Trump, I had another Republican pollster tell me that this is about 4 weeks ago, this was pre-Kavanaugh. He says, the biggest problem is we can't convince the Trump base that it matters who's in charge of Congress. Because the Trump voter didn't like Paul Ryan. The Trump voter didn't like Mitch McConnell, didn't care about them. When you ask the question, do you want to check on the White House? The Trump voter says, Donald Trump's my check on the establishment, whether it's the Republican establishment or the Democratic establishment. And so the big fear pre-Kavanaugh among these was that the Trump voter didn't care about the midterms, right? Because it was just, Trump's there, that's okay. Nancy Pelosi can't stop Trump. It just wasn't. And then Kavanaugh gave him a reason to, they're coming after Trump again. And so they viewed Kavanaugh as a surrogate for Trump. Because Kavanaugh pulled a Trump. Kavanaugh, look, that goes to my point earlier when I just think, look, politics has completely changed. This idea that you're supposed to go to the middle, moderate yourself. Not necessarily ideologically, but even in tone. But Kavanaugh moderated himself in that Fox interview and it fell flat. He came out like a raging maniac and it worked. That's sort of, I think, where it's sort of pick a side.
shut up and pick a side. Sorry, and this is it's interesting. Trump is defining our politics. And I think a lot of people didn't think that was going to happen. They thought, that Trump will bend to Washington's will, or Trump will bend to the Chamber of Commerce's will. No, everybody has bent to Trump's will. Everybody has bent, whether it's Dean Heller, whether it's Elizabeth Warren.
So what does that portend? Does that mean the Democrats need to find somebody who is going to be like that to challenge him?
Look, history says no. History says what? When we change presidents, we go for the exact opposite of what we had before, right? Whatever the weakness, perceived weakness was of the president that we had, we looked for that as a strength in the next candidate, right? So you can start with Carter, micromanager, hand-wringer, always pessimistic. Ronald Reagan, the eternal optimist, the above-it-all guy. Look at George H.W. Bush when he ran in '88. He wanted to be a kindler, gentler Republican because he realized that the perception of Reagan was that it was too harsh. Bill Clinton, feel your pain, versus what was the weakness of George H.W. Bush, out of touch, didn't really understand the common man. George W. Bush's tagline when he was running in 2000 was, I'm going to restore honor and integrity in the White House. Yeah, was he running against Al Gore or was he running against Bill Clinton, right? George W. Bush was Mr. Everything's in black and white, dead or alive. Barack Obama is all nuance, right? All gray area, right? In many ways, and he was that's what. And if you a skinny black guy versus an overweight old white guy, right? Like, what's the exact opposite of Barack Obama? Donald J. Trump. So I think it's the exact opposite is what the country is going to want, right? We sort of, what we don't like. There was one presidential candidate who I've talked to, potential presidential candidate, who's actually, I don't want to, we're on the record and I want to preserve the off the record, but I want to share a sentiment this candidate shared with me. This candidate said, look, I think the winning message in 2020 for a potential Democrat is going to be the candidate that best symbolizes integrity and unity, whatever that combination is, right? Because I think there's going to be a perception. I really think the nut of the Mueller probe is going to be pay to play. The whole idea that Washington was way pay to play, and in some ways so there's going to be this perception of that it's so who's going to come in and quote clean things up, and who's just going to be the high character person. And if you think about it, after Nixon, we went with Jimmy Carter, I will not tell a lie, right? And we were a divided country after the Iraq War, and we wanted, and Obama touched a nerve on the idea of unity. So I happen to believe that that is probably the best general election candidate they come up with. I just don't know if that's what the Democratic primary electorate's going to want. I think they look at, and they sit there and say, and I talk to progressives who say this, they say, wait a minute, we thought the Tea Party was alienating voters and couldn't win general elections. And sure, there was examples, Sharon Angle being a prime example right here in Nevada. But Donald Trump is in some ways the Tea Party's love child. So I think there's progressives, especially if Andrew Gillum wins in the state of Florida, okay? If you can win with as liberal of an agenda as Andrew Gillum is proposing in the state of Florida, and Florida's not one state, it's like 5 states. But if you can pull that off in the single most important swing state, sorry Nevada, but Florida, and get the numbers, will you? Just get 29 electoral votes and you'll get there, trust me. But there is, Florida's the ball game, you could argue, right? Florida is one of those states that it can be the ball game. Well, progressives, and this presidential candidate said to me, and this is somebody who wants to run as a progressive, said, if Gillum wins, I'm in. But if Gillum loses, I think it should be Biden. And that is the winning, that will prove that you can't yet win going as far left as the Republicans have shown that they can win in a swing state going a little further to the right. So I do think the Andrew Gillum race in particular, how he does, win or lose, is going to have a lot of impact on, I think, how far to the left the Democrats run in the primaries.
You and I are similar, I think, in the sense that we've been doing this a long time, but we're cynical in the sense that anybody doing, but we're still, I think, to do what we do, you still have to be optimistic to some extent, right? But it's really tough to be that way now, in this sense that if the Republicans manage to hold on to the House, and they probably are going to hold on to the Senate, then what you talked about in terms of race being an issue, there'll be a certain validation then that, oh, Trump was right. We don't have to worry about those voters. We just have to worry about our voters. That's terrible. If the Democrats take the House, they're probably going to start talking about impeachment, whether they'll actually go through with it or not. That's terrible too, for just in terms of the public's faith in the system. Either of those outcomes. Shine some light here. Make me happy, Chuck.
The same country that elected Donald Trump elected Barack Obama, and the same country that elected Barack Obama elected Donald Trump.
Was it the same country that elected Barack Obama? Are we the same, or are we forever changed?
Of course we're forever changed. But it's, I guess the biggest worry I have, where I'm mostly optimistic, the biggest worry I have is, have we so delegitimized is not the word I'm looking for here. Have we so dumbed down the idea of politics and campaigns that we treat it, the public accepts the idea that it's a bit of a soap opera and a reality show, and that it is about who's going to entertain me. Trump absolutely believes his rallies need to be entertaining. You know, it's funny. You know, the biggest to go back to the whole kneeling controversy that he created. Okay, all happened because he read a room and realized the reason he was there. So this all started when he ripped into Colin Kaepernick that first time in the September of 17. Do you remember what he was doing? He was campaigning in Alabama for Luther Strange, who was the appointed senator who ended up losing to Roy Moore in the primary. And Luther Strange just had no juice, right? It just wasn't exciting people. The base wasn't there. And literally, he's there, and he can just feel the crowd. They weren't into it. And he does. This is his other, every, successful presidents just have some different gifts. And one of them, they all know how to read a room. And he just said, well, I'm not going to bother talking about Luther Strange. I don't know if he even mentioned the guy's name, but for the first time he was out there. And he gets in the NFL, and it just starts to rile everybody up. And he realizes, oh, that's working tonight. It's like a stand-up comedian deciding, oh, those jokes are working tonight. I can do ethnic jokes in this room. They love it. I can't do it tomorrow night. I'll better come up with another shtick tomorrow night. And for him, it's shtick. But that's what he ends up doing, is that he improvises, and his biggest controversy was an improvisation on that front. So I worry that there's a growing acceptance that politics is entertainment. Look, I say this. Look at how cable news at night can look, right? It becomes these personality contests between the hosts sometimes. It started with Oberman or O'Reilly. So I can mention them by name because neither one of them work for the two entities anymore. I'm not going to name current names since we're recording. But again, I think some people view it as show business and not serious business. And I am concerned that, look, Donald Trump's the perfect, it turned out our social media narcissism moment that we're in, when we've decided that we've got to take pictures of ourselves everywhere we go. I didn't know we all wanted to take pictures of ourselves this much until we made it easy on ourselves, right? And whatever that is, and sharing ourselves, in some ways, Donald Trump I think pop culture sociologists 50 years from now will be able to explain it perfectly. They'll take they'll start with the OJ trial, which was the first time a news story became entertainment and became something people followed in real life. And then you thought, why do I want to follow fake drama when I can follow real drama? Then it was right after OJ we got the real reality, unscripted television, right? That's what we call it now. And then politics became our entertainment, right? Starting with Monica, and then it's really sort of been politics as entertainment. So that worries me, that there is this movement towards there, because it does garner a response. You can build an audience. I mean, Michael Avenatti actually believes he can run for president.
Right, right.
You know, maybe he can. I mean, I'm not writing people off anymore.
I was slack-jawed watching the whole Avenatti phenomenon, which I hope we're near the terminus of.
I think we are too.
But just watching like this guy
I think
suddenly,
he's Icarus. I think he already is melting. I think all that's true, but wow.
But I see the whole thing maybe slightly differently, maybe not, and I'm wondering what you think of this. When Trump did I could go out on Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and my people would still be with me. That is part of who his base is. They're blind, and we can look down on them or whatever else everybody thinks that we do. But then there's the other kind of folks who have given up on politicians because either they're bland or they're just disgorging these talking points that don't mean anything, or people think they don't take their job as seriously as they should. And so Trump comes along, and he's entertaining to a lot of people. He's different than Chuck Schumer, who's not, not very interesting, or maybe somebody who used to be a U.S. senator here, who's not, who I once referred to as charismatically challenged, although he was probably the best.
Can I just tell you?
He was probably the best elected official this state has ever had in terms of
Harry
what he
Reid's the
did for
greatest print interview you could have.
Right. Exactly.
I always say you would read a Harry Reid print interview and you'd be like, oh wow. And then as a TV guy, I'm like, all right, I got to cut that soundbite. Right? And you're like, and Mitt Romney lied on his taxes. Come on, man. Give me the money bite, right?
But Harry Reid, even though he wasn't a TV guy, was an incredibly effective politician in this state.
But in an old school way, in the old school way.
But I think people have gotten, for a variety of different reasons, and probably we as a business may be partly to blame too, they've gotten so alienated from government that a guy like Trump comes along. It's not just these people in his base that we think are these, idiots, for lack of a better word. There are people who just said, you know what, he's different. What Trump used to say is, how could you do worse? Right? And to a lot of people,
what do you got to lose?
What do you got to lose? I think that resonated with people who are not dumb, who are not idiots, who said, he can't be worse. And obviously he's, whatever they believed about him at the time. And the lack of seriousness with which people now take Congress. They don't take them seriously. Nope. And that's the bigger danger to me, I think.
Well, look, I think some of it was, what I always say is Trump is authentically inauthentic. That's one of his, meaning, and he's very comfortable. He's like, yeah, all this stuff is, I'll tell you how it works. It's all transactional. It's all this. And in some ways, look, I think that the absurdity of how the K Street community worked in Washington and works in Washington, between Trump and Mueller, I think we're going to take it down, and I think that's going to be really healthy. The lobbying community is way too, we did get to a point, and this is where I think that, Trump didn't cause any of this. Trump just took advantage of the opportunity that was there, but it's a really screwed up situation. And I think Congresswoman Berkeley and Senator Bryan, who I saw in here earlier, would both agree when your chief of staff can get a job for 3 times the salary that the member of Congress makes because they know you. And so then people went to work in Congress, and I'm not saying this happened to Congresswoman Berkeley's chief of staff, by the way. I saw you're nodding along, and I'm going, but I don't want people to think we know for sure. Yeah. But what it did is it created this sort of industry in Washington where people realize, if I really want to get rich quick, I go hurry up and do a stint as a chief of staff for some semi-powerful senator. And within a year and a half, I can get a very comfortable 6-figure salary and essentially be set for life. So then it really, it was the perversion of Congress. And I really think that this has been one of the bigger problems. And we lament money in politics and all this stuff in lobbying. And it's like everything, it was all the system worked when it was done in moderation, but like anything, when you do too much of it, and the lobbying community became too big and too lucrative, that I do think it sort of made Congress a stereotype, made people more cynical, and all these people are for sale, they all go there to get rich. I mean, how many, and people would see, oh, they used to be a member and now they're getting rich doing something else. You see somebody's net worth triple, and you're like, wait, you've been in, how did that happen? And what, land owning? You happen to own the right piece of land where you knew a federal government development was coming. I think all of that really got, the K Street world really got supercharged in the mid to late 90s. And, in some ways, I benefited from it. Our newsletter, the hotline, was sort of the gateway drug for these folks, but we were an insider publication. And I can tell you, it's like every year there were just more firms available to sell this product to. And it's like, in looking back, that was the beginning of sort of, that the burning of Rome began. So I think in some ways we haven't fully realized how Congress damaged itself, how the K Street Committee, how all of that, the professionalization of how legislating worked, and the distancing it came from the actual citizens, that it took about a generation for it to happen, and I think this is why we have what we have, and this is why people's perception of not having any high regard for any elected official comes from.
You've mentioned a couple times Mueller and in relation to all of this, and you've mentioned pay to play. You think he has something more than what we already know?
I do. And I don't say that just assuming everybody that look, he doesn't leak, and he doesn't. We've tried. But the people closest to Mueller, the people who have worked with him the longest, all say the same thing. He's known as a Boy Scout for a reason, but he also isn't frivolous. He is self-aware. He knows if he didn't have the goods, he'd have quit by now, because he knows how damaging it is if he doesn't have the goods. So I will be surprised. Now, I think the scandal is bigger than it's been portrayed, but it's different than you think. That it is more of a series of internet. Look, this is Russia was just one part. There were a lot of foreign entities that thought there was parts of an agenda for sale. You've seen bits and pieces of it come out, whether it's the magical. Have any of you ever had any of you own a building and had somebody pay their rent 99 years in advance? Somehow the Qatari government did that for a Jared Kushner building. It was pretty interesting. That's one of the stories that has come out. I mean, it's pretty good if you get somebody to pay their rent 99 years in advance. I mean, it's an amazing lease. The point is that there's a lot of that string, and I do think that everybody's so far down the Russia rabbit hole that it was, in some ways, it's not less than meets the eye, but that was one operation. And then there's going to be some other stuff that I think is going to make people feel ickier. And it will be the ease with which, look, the current situation with the Saudis. Now, in fairness to this president, he's not the first president that has had financial interests in the Gulf states. I think this is where I think the Mueller probe is going. And this is what I would be paying the most attention to after the election.
No matter what he does, as the guy who famously used the phrase, there is no such thing as alternative facts.
Yes.
Are you worried that people won't believe?
Yes. That I do. I think I actually think he has successfully sold the idea that everybody does it. It's not that it won't be believed, that people won't believe it's worth holding him extra accountable, holding him to the highest accountability you can hold a president. That's what I think. And this goes back to what I just described. I think they're going to say, oh, hey, he's pay to play. Well, what was the Clinton Foundation?
Right.
Okay. So in that sense, I think he has already successfully prevented himself from ever being impeached. But that doesn't mean it won't have an impact on how Washington operates going forward. I mean, I do think we will, try to find some way to at least prevent this ability from happening again, prevent foreign governments from having such ease to manipulate our government in ways that I think in some ways we've allowed almost too much openness on that front.
Let's talk for just a few minutes about the intersection of our business with all this. And I mentioned earlier, and I commend to all of you a piece that Chuck wrote in The Atlantic last month about journalism and about what you called a new kind of campaign that's underway. And this is exactly what you said. The campaign to destroy the legitimacy of the American news media. Talk about that.
No, look, and it's a campaign tactic. As I always say, this whole liberal bias, liberal bias, liberal bias. First of all, I always say we're all born with original bias. Okay? If we have a pulse, we have bias. Where you're born is bias. Who your parents are is bias. I have bias toward Cuba. I grew up in Miami. I have bias toward that issue. I was more likely to ask questions about our Cuba policy in the White House briefing room than my buddy Jake Tapper. He grew up in Philadelphia. He cared about some things that were, so you can have parochial bias. But if you look at this modern campaign of going after the quote mainstream media, it all goes back to Nixon. Okay, it all goes back to sort of the revenge of the, and this is where I use Roger Ailes as the character here, because what Roger Ailes did, television genius, yes. Journalist, no, but he never intended to be a journalist as a head of a network. He ran it as a political campaign in the way he'd run any political campaign. And if you can win with positive persuasion, great. But if you can't, you go negative. And we in the press just didn't view ourselves this way, and we've been under assault of what I would argue. You particularly look at whether it's the truly the big media here, but you guys have a version of this here with where you have somebody who's got their own political agenda owning, what was once the largest newspaper. So it was a campaign, and we as journalists are trained, or at least I was brought up in the era of, don't engage, don't engage, don't engage. But we didn't engage for 25 years. And eventually, if one person keeps saying something over and over again, liberal bias, liberal bias, liberal bias, liberal bias, people just automatically assume it. I have good friends of mine, I have good relatives of mine that just see the peacock and just say, look, I love watching you. I'm a Republican, okay? And I'm like, I don't care. I have Republicans and Democrats. I'm not anything. I really am not. In Virginia, we don't have to register by party. It's great. I vote in every primary that you can pick, any primary. What's great about it is I get all the direct mail. So that's the best part of it. Or at least I think it is. Probably to all of you, you're like, please, if I get another goddamn piece of direct mail. And I'm sitting there going, the U.S. Postal Service would be out of business without direct mail. But we didn't defend our journalism. I don't think our job is to go and attack those, you counter and go negative on them. But we didn't defend our work, and we haven't shown our work. So in that sense, when I say we need to sort of change our ways a little bit tactically, one of them is we need to show our work so people see. I try to tell people all the time, I'll get email, and I'm like, if I was making it up, I'd be fired. And I point to the things that we've done at NBC. We've held people accountable who've lied on air. And we've done so more than any other institution has, at least of our, and that's something, I look at that as that's what we're trying to do. That's how you restore credibility. I always think that there's nothing makes me more comfortable with a news organization than one that runs corrections regularly. I see that as a good thing, not a bad thing. But now mistakes are used as cudgels to the press, and then you get to the point where you're afraid of making any mistakes. And then what does that do? It changes your reporting to the point of where you do back off. And then you do sit there and you sort of defang, and maybe you write too subtly and you write too nuanced. I go back to what I said before, is that I think we need to be more direct. We need to say what we see. And in this case, what do I see? This was a campaign to delegitimize us because it would make it easier for them to win their, whether in Roger Ailes' case, it was just a business decision. It was good business.
I just want to read what I thought was the most stunning paragraph from that piece for a variety of different reasons. And then I'm really interested in what you meant by the end of this. For me, idle death threats are now the norm. Mm-hmm. I don't take them seriously because if I did, I'd never feel at peace. Okay, I read that and I said, Jesus, I know this guy. Yeah. I mean, that's a stunning thing to say. I'm not done with the paragraph yet, but I want you to, that's a stunning thing to say.
Well, look, I hesitated saying it because I do think one of our problems in our politics is that people are clamoring to be victims. I just think it's a, look at me, I was attacked, look at me, I feel, and I don't, and whether it's, oh, it's such an unfair, this is the worst biased report against me, and everything's about, so this over-victimization. At the same time, I also think, I will have people on the right that say, oh my God, the left is so much more vicious than the right. And, and the right, or the left will say the right is so much, and I'm sitting there going, I wish I could say one of you was worse than the other. But there are, it is stunning the crazy things you get. And I've oddly become more empathetic of elected officials, by the way, because, and John and I were talking about this earlier, because I know he takes his share of attacks here. We're treated like public officials now too, in some, and I hate that. I think that's not, we're just sort of, we're armed with pencils. We're not armed with anything else. Don't shoot at us. Shoot at each other, fine. We're here to, tell everybody else who shot who or whatever. But it's, that part of it, I felt like he had to share. It's like, look, I do think some of my colleagues have taken it so personally that they've let it show in their work. And I think that's, by the way, we're human beings. So I get it. I sort of empathize with it. But I also made a case, I said it there, but I don't say it anywhere else. I do think there are too many people that are a little bit Cassandra about it.
Yeah, I don't think we should make it about ourselves. Right. I don't feel like a victim. I know you don't either, despite...
No, and I don't. And the thing is, they are idle. They are, I'm sorry, anybody who's been an elected official, sadly, the death threat is something that does come. It's obvious. Look, unfortunately, it only has to be right once. But 999 times out, it's just the kooky person who's lonely in their basement.
Well, what you said in there, I was just stunned because I know you, and I was kind of stunned just to read it, even though intuitively I knew it was true. But what you said afterwards stuck with me even more. But forget the personal animus or safety issues reporters now face. American democracy requires a functioning press that informs voters and creates a shared set of facts. Yeah. If journalists are going to defend the integrity of their work and the role it plays in sustaining democracy, we're going to need to start fighting back. Mm. Now, I read some of the response to that, but I guess there's a lot more. I think there was a sense, even though I think I agree with everything that you said there, the whole issue of the fighting back, right?
It got taken out of context.
Right, but people, I'm still wondering a little bit, you explained, but what do you mean that we should be fighting back? What should we be doing that we're not doing?
Look, and this is, I wish it were more than just what I think it is, which is saying what we see, not sugarcoating. I do think, and that's the sense where we've helped participate in rounding the edges, when maybe we shouldn't be rounding the edges. Maybe everybody needs to feel how sharp the edges are better, so they're better informed. And that's what I think that it's defending our work, showing our work. Again, I go back to this transparency. I think when the New York Times have done these big exposés, they've actually done that. And I think good for them. And I personally, as a consumer of political polling, think them showing how polling works in real time is potentially misleading to the consumer. Not all sausage should be seen, but I appreciate the larger goal of transparency. And the more people see that this is like very much labor intensive and whatever it is, you see that we're not personally manipulating, we're just doing the best we can. We're giving you the truth as the best we can know it in the moment that we report it. And in that sense, so look, the fighting back is defending our work. And I think some people saw it as, somehow going after the Sean Hannitys of the world. No, but honestly noting why he's doing what he's doing. And in many ways, it does strike me as ironic that the people that attack you and I for being media elites are the wealthiest people in our industry. It's not lost on me that, trust me, that Laura Ingraham, I think, makes more in a night, or than probably the entire staff in a month of the Independent.
Don't ask for a raise.
Yeah. And that's what's screwed up is the incentive structure, right? The financial. I go back to what I said about how the lobbying community works. That the financial incentives is not to work in Congress to do public service, but to work in Congress to go get rich on K Street. And the incentive is to be outrageous and entertaining if you really want to become a multimillionaire. If you want to be Sean Hannity and Laura Ingraham and Tucker Carlson, it's not hard. I just hope you can sleep at night.
When you and I first started in the business, certainly when I did, and when you first started at the Hotline, there was really no such thing as the web. There was no such thing as Twitter.
We used to say we were the internet before the internet. That was my way of describing the Hotline.
Right. It was fax to people. But the vitriol that is on the web, especially on Twitter, where there's a lot of journalists, where a lot of people follow politics. I mean, I know what my mentions look like some days. Like when I say I'm hosting Chuck Todd.
God love you.
Those are the worst days. But seriously, I can't even imagine what yours looks like. It's changed the whole calculus. Things can be driven through Twitter and then into bigger stories than just contained in a platform that, by the way, most people are not on.
Oh, it's amazing how influential Twitter is in our business and how few real Americans read Twitter every day, right? And by the way, I would say this, as a journalist, I probably paid too much attention to Twitter and not enough to Facebook. Because it turns out Facebook is the community bulletin board.
Right.
Or as my brother-in-law, who's a high school principal outside of Pensacola, says, Facebook's the devil. Because he says, forget the students, he says, try dealing with parents and teachers, parents that read a teacher's post on Facebook and decide it's too political, and try that. Oh my God, he goes, Facebook's the devil. But that's the, it's funny, I tweet less than I used to because you get a couple, there's a lot of these clown sites out there now that are just basically have popped up just to create viral moments. They're just clickbait sites. The Hill's become a clickbait site. It used to be an actual news oriented. It's really just clickbait. Yeah. Just to drive traffic. Daily Caller's a clickbait site. And there's sometimes The Intercept's a clickbait site. I mean, this is not a one ideology doesn't have the monopoly on the clickbait world. And I can't tell you how many times I'll have tweeted just something. And like the Hill tries to turn it into a headline in order for Tucker to notice so that he'll do a segment on a show attacking NBC, so then it becomes some New York Post page 6 item of Tucker Carlson or Sean Hannity versus Chuck Todd. And it's like, well, forget that. I'm just not going to tweet anymore. And that's a retreat that I'm like, wait a minute, you shouldn't retreat from this. When Twitter works, I love it. And I'll say this, John, for what it's worth, is that I've been whined about this enough. I give Twitter credit. They actually have been trying to reach out to people to say, there are ways to essentially clean up the mentions. And they actually, if you mess around with it enough, you can at least get rid of all of that in a way that allows a little better interactivity. But it's hard, I think, just, people it's amazing what people will tweet. They'll never say it to your face, right? I always want to say, just tweet like your mother's reading the tweet, right? If everybody tweeted that way, it'd probably be boring and nobody would be on Twitter, but.
That's exactly right. So, final question, then if you have any questions for Chuck, we'll take about 15 minutes. He does have to catch a plane at some point, but, so, look 10 years in the future. You probably thought a little bit about this. What's it going to look like in our business and how we cover a government and politics, and what's government and politics going to look like?
10 years from now, it'll be Trump's third term. I'm not joking. No. You know, look, I think, I do believe that one of the reasons why we're so disoriented is sort of politically what we do for a living is that one of the ways I comfort myself is that, my God, we are repeating what happened essentially at the turn of the 19th and 20th century. Okay, the turn of the 19th century, in some ways, right? We were disoriented as a society, moving from agrarian to industrial. We were disoriented because we were getting massive amounts of immigrants at that time coming in from Europe, and it was creating all sorts of tension. And we were, I mean, look at, you know, the most drastic immigration laws were drawn up in the 20s and 30s in this country in response to that. So in some ways, we've been through this before. It's why that John Meacham book is like political history for the chicken soup, history for the soul. In that, you know, he notes these moments in history. We've been through moments like this before, and we always find our way out of it. I do think we are in this middle of this political realignment, right? And I do think some of it is, you know, I think you know, I will say this, and I think this is something that the left and millennials don't fully understand, is that, you know, change happens slowly and then fast, rather than fast and then slowly. So, you know, it's like, you know, we joke, you know, when you hear about a company that goes bankrupt, they go bankrupt slowly until it happens immediately, right? And then it's off a cliff. So I think we're in the middle of this realignment. I think that the 2016 election largely was about rural America going, look, can we just tap the brakes on globalization? I get it. We're more connected. It's coming. I'm not saying that, but the collective message that if everybody took the message as, can we tap the brakes? I'm not saying turn around. We just want to slow down. You know, in some ways, the social change that has taken place in the first 18 years of the 21st century is astounding. And I think sometimes we forget how fast, okay? It was only 14 years ago that being for same-sex marriage was a political liability. It was 2004, that's yesterday to you and I. So that is the fastest transformation. Weed, legalize weed. That was not even remotely on the radar in 2004. Barack Obama, by the way, was against same-sex marriage in 2008. So I do think the cultural changes did happen in a hurry. And I think sometimes if you sort of, that in 30 years, that's what maybe some parts of the 2016 election will be. So that I do think we're in the middle of this cultural, so and some of it, as the boomers age out, however you want to call that, retire from voting. I'll call it, as boomers retire from voting. And the millennials become the generation that essentially, I mean, you could argue that for 50 years, our politics has revolved around the boomers, right? It started with lowering the voting age to 18. Who was that in response to? The boomers, right? Our politics is catered to this class because they were the largest class. They were the largest voting class. As soon as millennials outnumber the boomers at the ballot box, they outnumber them in reality, they don't outnumber them at the ballot box, then you'll see some of that shift sort of finish and complete. So I do think some of this is, we're in the middle of this realignment. Well, like I said, we'll have people age into voting and age out of voting. And you know, we're trying to figure out what our place is in the world a little bit. So I guess in 10 years, I think the two parties will be reoriented again. I am curious to see which party becomes the party of business. I actually think that's going to be up for grabs in 10 years. Maybe this will, I think one of the interesting things about the Trump phenomenon, both positive and negatively, is that I think it has made corporate America reassess how it participates into politics. In that you're going to, I think, see a little bit attempts at more self-governance, a little bit. I think you're going to have, fewer, while we have one or two gigantic billionaire donors to each party, I think you're going to see some companies and corporations feel as if maybe they're going to retreat a little bit from the corporate donation game. Maybe it's not necessarily good for business. Nobody wants the boycotts, right, left or right. So part of me is going to be, I am curious. I think the one unknown I have, it's like which party ends up the party of business, which party ends up the party of that world, and I think that could be up for grabs because it feels as if the right coalition in this country is going to be a little more nationalist, which means a little more protectionist, and does that mean the left, if they're a little more global citizen-y, does it also make them a little more open to business, or is it going to make, that part of it has got to sort itself out a little bit too. But I think we're in the middle of this sort. I have this theory that in 10 years, Paul Ryan and Barack Obama will be a member of the same party, and Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump will be a member of the same party. But we're just in the middle of this realignment, and we haven't fully gotten there yet.
All right, we're going to have time for 10 or 15 minutes of questions if you guys have any questions. Elizabeth has a mic, so raise your hand if you have a question. Elizabeth, did you find somebody already?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. Because Heather seems desperate to ask a question.
I will get to Heather. Never you worry.
This is really scary. John knows every one of you in this room. I mean, it's like...
Do not worry, Heather. We will be to you. Stand up, please. No. Oh, I won't hold the mic. No, you're not allowed to hold the mic.
Oh, wow.
No grandstanding.
That is smart.
I taught
Good
her
for
that
you.
one, yeah.
That's right.
You taught her well. Helen Foley, I wanted to ask you about this whole new nonpartisan factor that we have. It seems that in Nevada, that number has gotten so large now that it's really going to affect all of these races. What do you think about that locally and nationally?
You're talking about nonpartisan voter registration?
Yes.
It's interesting. This is a phenomenon that is not unique to Nevada. I mean, the number 2 party in California is no party. Democrats are 1, no party's 2. I think the Republicans are 3rd in that one. It's the fastest growing affiliation in Florida. They call them NPAs there, just no party affiliation. Here's the thing, you talk to political strategists and they will tell you just because they register that way, they still vote 80 or 90% of the time the same way, left or right, which is, the theory in this country still, and the theory that most campaigns now I think operate on is this idea that yes, the independent is a swing voter, but they swing between voting and not voting depending on if the issues they care about are being animated by one of the 2 candidates. Versus, and so, I think there's some people that think, oh, this will mean the great moderate hope or the great independent hope. The problem is, it is hard to have a movement that excites people that is based in moderation, right? Right? It's counterintuitive, and I think that is why these third way attempts, whether it's Bloomberg's flirtations multiple times, what Kasich may or may not try and do, what is always imagined by my longtime mentor, a guy named Doug Bailey, who's now passed, who was obsessed with trying to create unity tickets. He believed both parties were essentially bankrupt and needed this sort of cleansing moment. I do think we need the cleansing moment. One of the great things about Ross Perot is it actually made both parties reassess who they were. Now, and some of you may not like which ways each party went in response to Perot, but Perot forced them to, force the Republican Party. Are you going to at least pay lip service to the deficit or not? Or force the Democratic Party to make a decision where they are in trade and what kind of party they're going to be. So in some ways he made, or Bill Clinton was never talking about fiscal responsibility until Ross Perot started bringing up the debt, right? So I think it's an opportunity there to force the parties to reform, but I also think this is a reflection on the weakness of the two parties. It's not about the strength and independent, it's just that people feel as if there's nothing to be gained by being a member of either party.
Jon Ralston, answer that same question that Ms. Foley asked, but in the Nevada framework, because we do have one of the highest ratios of nonpartisan voters in the country, and we've seen a fairly steady and surprising growth. We're almost at, I think, Michelle Rendell's correct me, we're over 20% now or close to it?
We're almost 30% with nonpartisans and other parties.
So talk about this in Nevada, because there's
Elizabeth,
something going on
Elizabeth,
here.
First of all, I'll answer it really quickly, but I think this is one of those rarest of nights when nobody really cares what I think. But I will answer that very briefly. It's really a lot of what Chuck said that's happening other places is the same thing that's happening here, in the sense that I think people have started to lose faith in the parties, and they've started to migrate outside of the parties. But political consultants and campaigns still look at them as what are their voting patterns? Which way are they leaning? Now, most of the nonpartisans in this state this year are leaning against Trump. And so that is why Democrats feel pretty good about those races at the top of the ticket where there is 7-10% undecided. They believe that they can capture them. By the way, I'm not so sure they're right about that. But I do think that these independents, even though for whatever reason they've decided they don't want to be part of a major party, still lean one way or another, even after they just don't want to call themselves a Democrat anymore, call themselves Republican anymore. So I think that's what's generally going on.
One of the things we've noticed is that in our study of in the ideological study of those that describe themselves as independent is that you're seeing the independents ideologically lean right now. In the first part of this decade, first part of the century, the independents leaned left a little bit when the Democrats were sort of and they didn't have the White House. So part of that,
right.
that does happen.
Goes back and forth, yeah.
Back and forth, anyway.
Are you really, you're going to hold the mic for me? Yeah.
I am. There's no trust, Heather. Not in this scenario.
So my question actually relates to one of the things you've touched on a couple times, which is emotion in journalism.
Yeah.
And I guess when I think about credibility in journalism and how it's evolved, I've always thought of journalists as like Stoic philosophers. There's no emotion in this
Right.
at all. It's all analytics, it's fact-based. Yeah. And yet in recent years, it seems like anyone who's involved in journalism, no matter what their inclinations may be, bring their own emotion and their own point of view into something. Yeah. And when they report on it, you can feel it. And I wonder if that affects the credibility of the industry. And how do you think about that?
You know, it's funny. I hate it. Right. I still see myself as sort of this. No, we're observers. Right. The journalist is the observer. Is explaining the why, is telling you what happened, but also giving you the why, sort of why, and trying to be, trying to tell you like, all right, they're sort of rounding the edges on this, too much over here and too much over there. I think the problem was the celebrification of journalism. Is that because of the rise of cable? Is it because of the rise of the internet? Is it because of the fact that the incentive structure? I go back to we're a free market, we're a capitalist society for a reason, right? So you respond to the incentive structures. What are the incentive structures? You make less if you do what you say. You make more if you do what Hannity does. And I'm laying that out in sort of a stark terms. But the highest paid people in my network are the opinion people, not the news people. And I don't say that, I'm glad, I am amazed at the living I get to make, okay? I'm lucky, it's unbelievable. And I pinch myself. But I do think it's the perverse incentive structure in general that's there, and the fact that people, and frankly, the readers, that there is you can build an audience with niche, right? And that is, I think that's what, so the more you narrowcast, it worked really well when you can make money doing a newsletter on an industry, that's niche, or when the niche becomes ideology. You know, it was sort of when talk radio moved to television. It seems to be, and then of course we've defined media. Look, there's a whole bunch of people that are on news channels that aren't journalists. And yet I get held accountable for their journalism. You know, so that's, you know, and that also then has created tension in our industry, right? Where you feel as if, wait a minute, I'm being defined by that. I got to define, you know, I'm gonna take control of my own brand. I'm gonna take control of my own. And so I think that has also added to it a little bit. But we've celebrified politics and celebrified journalism. You know, they made a movie about, you know, Robert Redford played Bob Woodward, you know, and a whole bunch of people went into journalism thinking they were going to be Robert Redford, not Bob Woodward. I almost like wonder if that didn't help. Like, you know, we in one ways we celebrated it. That's great. You know, I'm happy for our industry, but you know, that I think that's part of it, is that the reporters, there was a way to make money to be a personality. And then, you know, now it's out of control. You know, now it's a path. It used to be sort of the perk at the end of a career. You know, I'm friendly with Tony Kornheiser. He to me has, you know, he was a reporter, and then he earned the right to be a columnist, then he earned the right to be on television. That was sort of what you thought the earned path was. And now it's like, no. Skip all the reporting part and all that stuff. You can go right to opinion and make a ton of money, whether it's in, doesn't always have to be in politics either, by the way. I mean, look what's happening to sports news. You know, look what's happening to Hollywood news, entertainment news, you know, and all that's called, whatever you want to call pop culture news.
By the way, Heather, I'm frankly very disappointed that Chuck, over the years, has not been as stoic as I am, but that's a topic for a different day.
Jon
But you're right
Ralston?
about the emotion. I'll just say that on election night 2016, I said something to people off air. Remember, half the country's ecstatic, and half the country isn't. Not a whole country. Just, by the way, I looked at it. I had a ton of fun on election night because it was an unknown, a story developed in real time.
Yeah.
You know, and that's what I said. I said, guys, embrace the story. Yeah. We'll worry about it tomorrow. But our job, the voters spoke. Let's report on it and explain it. Don't wallow in it.
Yep. Elizabeth, where did Elizabeth go? I don't know where she. Oh, there she is. She has a microphone. Yeah. Couple more questions, I think.
No, Tom Collins. No, Tom Collins.
Hi, Felicia Ortiz. So I would like to know how you feel, or what you feel, how you feel race will play a role in the race coming up, and not only in this year's race, but in upcoming races.
Yeah, we started with you were the one who said it's all about race, right?
I think,
what does that mean
I think
now?
I think that we've ripped that Band-Aid off right now, and that's a big part of it. Look, I guess Hispanic turnout's going to decide Nevada and Arizona Senate races. So in that respect, obviously race is a factor. The immigration conversation feels more racial than policy, right? So in that sense, I think it plays a role. In Florida, Andrew Gillum is animating different constituencies. For instance, in South Florida, the Caribbean community, a whole bunch of the non-white communities. So that's a case where race is in benefiting him and may turn that in. And so there's you know, we sometimes look at race as sort of the polarizing version of it, and then race as the inspirational. Oh, there's someone like me on the ballot. There's someone, you know, so I think you will see it, you know, play, I think, different ways in that respect. But I would say probably the most divisive on the race front is probably Georgia, with what's going on there, because it's also the issue of voter access is at the forefront of that race, because of race, because the Republican nominee is the Secretary of State and he's in charge of the process, because the Democratic nominee has been working to get more African Americans registered and using a process that conservatives have believed isn't a way to register voters, and progressives say, how else are you going to register voters? But we can, and so in that sense, I think, I certainly think that you can't help but look at those results in a racial context. So, does the Hispanic community turn out in bigger numbers than we've seen in Arizona and in Nevada? And if they do, and it helps Democrats, well, that's going to be an obvious response to Trump and his antagonism on the issue. And look, we'll see. He's had some, this is a very combustible ending to this campaign if it ends with the president railing against the caravan of Hondurans that are coming to the border. This is in the same way, there was a moment you're just like, during the Kavanaugh hearings, you're not sure how this is going to play, but it's combustible and it's going to move things. That's going to move things. I don't know how. There's a chance it moves it in different directions. But I have to say, buckle your seatbelts, because it does look like he's going to close with a border fight. And of course, this will immediately roll right into a fight over funding the border wall come the last 6 weeks of this Congress before the new Congress comes in. So look, I think it's going to be front and center, both black and brown.
I think one more question, Elizabeth, what do you think?
Do you and Bob
Two more
Coffin want to
questions?
arm wrestle
Okay.
for this question?
2 more questions.
Bob
I'm told.
Coffin and Tom Collins want to arm wrestle for this question.
No.
Should we let them do? Oh, I'm not giving you the mic.
My vote would be for neither, but you're stuck.
Should I go somewhere else? I've already come this way. Please ask a good question.
Yes, and it's in 2 parts, as you mentioned about the racial stuff and the voter suppression and whatnot, and tying that to the way that voters in the Midwest put the brakes on of the globalization, keeping their jobs, is the first part. The second part of it is since Trump's been in there, his just diminishing departments, EPA and Interior and Justice attacks and so forth. So how is that going to play? People are going to keep voting for that. Is it still going to be the split country because of that?
Split on when it comes to, what do you mean?
Well, the half the country went for Trump, half didn't.
Right.
Okay, so that same split is the coastal, basically the coast
Right.
and the rurals, interior states.
You're asking
Well-
him to predict voter turnout on this issue.
I'm just saying, how much, when you mentioned putting the brakes on,
Yeah.
okay, how does that connect to now and going forward, because they've putting the brakes on the EPA and fuel
well.
emissions and everything else?
Well, look,
Right, has Trump done enough to satisfy them? That's the question, right?
Short climate change.
Well, look, let me take climate change separately. I actually think it's good. I think Florida, again, good old Florida, I think Florida's going to be the state that is the first one that where the terminology is going to change from climate change to climate adaptation. Because at the end of the day, I think the first Republican officials that are going to basically say, we've got to legislate, we've got to do something about this, and let's not argue over whether it's man-made or not. We just have to, deal, coastal communities, South Florida's got to figure this out. So I think Florida's going to be the first place where I think the climate issue gets depoliticized, because it becomes sort of a way of life. There are no Republican beaches or Democratic beaches in Florida, right? And I think that in that sense, because people move to Florida for the weather, for the environment, for instance, there was always a bipartisan coalition in Florida that stopped offshore oil drilling. And it was, Jeb Bush stopped it, Lawton Child stopped it. It was just, that was always sort of a bipartisan thing on that front. And I keep bringing up Florida because obviously I'm from there, but we also have this major problem of the red tide with dead fish showing up on the wealthiest parts of the Gulf, by the way, which is always helpful, right? When the environmental stuff happens to wealthy people, right? Suddenly people want to do something about it. But so I do think climate adaptation is going to become, because look, a fiscal conservative in Congress should want to say, are we going to keep using FEMA dollars to keep rebuilding the same things over and over again, or should we have smart building, smart policy, smart climate adaptation, and things like that? So I do think this, while it's short-term gutting and the regulations and all this stuff, I think is I think rattling some environmentalists. I think the reality of the importance of Florida as an electoral state will sort of start to shift this conversation a little bit. So I'm actually optimistic that, because, you know, as with any crisis in this country, we don't deal with it until we're literally at the cliff, ready to jump. And I think at times in Florida, it feels like we're inching towards the cliff. And we're going to be the first place, I think, to truly physically see the effects. I mean, I know the effects are in a lot of places, but Florida will be an easy place for us to show the effects, and then that will shift that conversation. As for the other parts, I do think if the president continues on this tariff war, that while he won't lose his Midwest rural base now, it is at risk in 2 years if he's not careful.
All right, so it's almost 9 o'clock. I'm sorry to cut this off, and it's better that we end with Chuck talking about the second most important swing state in the country.
Hashtag we matter.
We matter. I want to. Yeah.
I'm a nobody, but I'd like to make a comment and ask a question.
Ma'am, we're done. Ma'am.
Be appropriate.
Ma'am.
I served as an intelligence analyst with the 101st Airborne Division during Vietnam. I'm an expat, and I could no longer sit by and watch our country be decimated, our democracy. So I flew from Calgary, Alberta, the Canadian Rockies, to come here and volunteer on my own dime to work with Jackie Rosen's campaign. We, the people, are suffering an emotional toll. There are children in cages. Humanity is not a hierarchy. When I was 11, I was placed in an orphanage. It was called the Children's Home of Reading, home of the friendless children. To this day, I'm astounded when someone likes me. I'm asking you to teach, to set an example, to model asking good questions. When a politician says, I'm for family values, show them to ask the question, what specifically do you value about the family? That's all I'm asking.
Thank you.
Thank
You
you.
very much. We appreciate it.
Thank you for your passion.
Chuck, I really do appreciate you coming out to support this cause, and I think everybody here tonight really appreciated this discussion.
Look, I'm going to say this. It sort of addresses, I think, her concerns, which is, as people feel this anxiety, and I run into this a lot. I think it's real anxiety. I run into it at home. I actually take a little bit of optimism in what you're doing here with the Nevada Independent, what many of you are doing in this room, what I'm trying to do myself, reassess sort of my role in this. What did we do to create this situation, or or what have we done to contribute? What can we do to sort of refresh ourselves as citizens, refresh ourselves in civics, refresh ourselves in the roles that we play in all of this? You had the guts, John, to say, we got some crappy large media companies here that aren't doing the citizens of the state well, and you said, you know, I've built up some political capital, and I'm going to use it. And you did. You've put yourself out there, and it's an example of re-engaging as a citizen, not just re-engaging as a journalist, re-engaging in civics. So in some ways, I want to amplify what the woman said in the back there, because I do think this is a moment where we're all sort of shell-shocked. Okay, we're disoriented. Some in a positive way, and some in a negative way. But I take solace in the fact that people are more engaged today than they were 3 years ago. So in some ways, that's a good thing. And I do think it's a chance we're going to look back on the 2016 election and say it was one of the most important moments in a positive way in American history. It just may take us 30 years to figure out what that is. Anyway, thanks very much.